Hi Scrabblers! I thought I'd start this video by giving you a little better idea of how my Scrabble life's been going outside of these videos. When I started, if you remember my first video, I just played online, had absolutely no live Scrabble experience besides when I played with my family when I was little. But now I've decided to kind of get into the live tournament scene. I started playing this summer after I graduated. I go to clubs most week and I've actually already played 2 live tournaments, the last of which was the Western Canadian Scrabble Championship, in which I got first out of 22 people in my division. So it's going pretty well. I hope that gives me a little bit more credibility when it comes to what I'm saying in these videos. And for this video, I'm going to continue with what we outlined initially with talking about defense. One thing many experts will tell you about defense is that it's imaginary. Now, not all of it, but a large portion of what beginners perceive as good defense is not defensive at all, and the threat that they're protecting from is, in that sense, imaginary. Now, what you probably taught yourself about defense already is that you should act a little bit like Senator Joe McCarthy and fear the red, or avoid giving your opponent access to the triple word scores. My father was particularly neurotic about this, and no matter what hit he was taking to his offense, he would always avoid at any costs playing on the perimeter of the board. What you'll learn in this video is that often what you think is a gift to your opponent is not, and could actually be a Trojan horse in disguise. On the flip side, something that you could never even consider could turn out to be the biggest mistake of your game. Now, defense is a tricky mistress. It's complicated like tile valuation. However, tile valuation was easily quantifiable and therefore easy to explain, even though it might not have been easy to grasp for a lot of non-mathematicians. Analyzing defense has never taken the path of brute force computation and has never exactly been quantified. Now, when Quackle makes a play in a game, it has some sort of extremely basic algorithm that it uses to try and assess the defensive nature of the play. However, it's so vague that when it's assessing your plays that you ask it for, it almost never takes defense into consideration. The correct way to teach defense is so elusive that Joe Edley doesn't even mention defense in his book Everything Scrabble, except for a short bit on whether you should close or open the board depending on the score, and we'll be discussing that in a later video. The idea behind defense is relatively simple. If you have an offensive play that's worth 6 points more than a defensive play, to justify making the defensive play, you would have to lower your opponent's score on his next turn by an average of 6 points or more. However, because you never know exactly what's on your opponent's rack, it's almost impossible to keep them from scoring altogether. But you can decrease their scoring opportunities. By decreasing both the frequency and the magnitude of his scoring opportunities, you'll find yourself making a good defensive play. Take a look at this board. Using what you know about offense, identify the most prominent hotspots that you see. Here are 8 that I found. Now, without knowing what your rack is, identify which hotspot you would make your play at. You can't say for certain when playing from a blind rack, but these 2 are good bets because a relatively large number of tiles can be placed here, i.e. they're high frequency, and if you do, they'll return a large number of points, i.e. high magnitude. Now, assume you've actually just played plan, and it's your opponent's turn now. You've opened up 2 great hotspots for her. If she takes one, she also blocks the other, leaving you with nothing. So let's take a mulligan on that play. Instead, we can play the same word here, while giving your opponent no hotspots, and in fact, closing one of the other 6 off. Now, instead, your opponent has 5 hotspots, 4 of which are either low probability or low magnitude. At this point, one of the biggest defensive worries is your opponent hooking an E or an S onto the end of stat to give themselves a rather juicy bingo lane. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about this right now. Triple triples are the fastest way to rack up points and really only happen if the stars align or your opponent is foolish. To risk putting an attractive tile like an E or an S in a triple triple lane, your play would have to have a significant offensive advantage over the next best play. I have a hefty 100-point lead at the end of a game. Now, the only thing my opponent can do to catch up is to post a triple triple. In my best interest, I want to play basically anything that's not going to give my opponent that opportunity. So don't be selfish and go for the extra 40 points if you can bingo, if that gives them the opportunity to win. Play it safe, cut them off, and don't give them anywhere to make a comeback. Having a good grasp of digraphs and common letter orders is important at analyzing risk. If you put an H in row 2, which is commonly preceded by an S, C, T, or W, you're running a pretty big risk. The same as if you were to put an E in row 14, which is commonly followed by an S, N, D, or R. These are pretty big gifts to your opponents because they can take advantage of them easily. On the flip side, playing a G in row 2 is not that big of a gift because there are not many words, relatively, that have a G as the second letter. You open up with this starting rack. The choices are pretty obvious. While you can't get rid of the V, and you're not going to have a very good leave, froth and fourth are definitely your best plays. Now these can both be played in two positions to take care of the opening hotspot, which covers the double word score and the double letter score. These are both with the F or the H on the double letter score. While offensively identical, defensively they're all very much different. Now if you play fourth like this, it's pretty obvious that by putting the O next to these two double letter scores that you're giving your opponent a good opportunity for plays like Joe, which would be pretty high scoring for them. On the other hand, playing froth in the same position gives your opponent really good opportunities at extending that to the triple word score with suffixes like IER or ILY, and your opponent is pretty likely to have one of these and to score big with them. These two plays with the F on the double letter score don't have the same defensive considerations as the other two plays and actually simulate very close to each other. The only discrepancy is that by putting froth here, your opponent can extend it with an SHO, a word that they're not likely to know. So playing one of these two is your best play. Sometimes your opponent will open up for you a high probability and high magnitude hotspot, only to find that luckily you have exactly the tiles that can't play there. Now in this situation you have three options. You can completely yield it to your opponent, scoring well elsewhere. You can block it with minimum scoring, or you can play elsewhere on the board, opening up a hotspot that's of about equal magnitude and probability. Now this is a concept similar to forking in chess. You force your opponent to choose one, leaving the other for you. The idea is that on average, you'll come out to about a net zero difference in points. This is a risky maneuver. Your opponent will always take the better spot, so if the two hotspots aren't completely equal, then you're going to find yourself holding the short end of the stick. Also, with your inability to snatch the original hotspot, it often means that you have a very ugly rack. Now, while it may have improved with one play, it also will be trouble when it comes to claiming your opponent's leftovers that you might not be able to play there either. Through tile tracking and making inferences on your opponent's last few plays, you can form a pretty good understanding of the kinds of tiles that your opponent has on their rack. In some situations, you can open up a hotspot that you are guaranteed to convert before they do. The most black and white case of this would be to play a word up to the triple word score lane that only takes an S hook, knowing that you hold the last S in the game. With the rack of CC, FH, IIT, Fitch is really the only play worth pursuing. Now it can be played at either 8D or 8H for the same amount of points, but again this differs defensively because if you play Fitch at 8H, not only does it place the I next to the double letter score tiles, but it can also be extended for maybe not the most common words, but definitely lucrative Fitchettes and Fitchus. Placing Fitch at 8D poses neither of these problems, and in this situation is the best play. Now let's switch the rack up a little bit and assume that one of those C's is actually a Q. In this case, it's still considered that Fitch at 8D is the best place. Let's hold on a second. Playing Fitch at 8D, while defensively better, is not being fair to yourself. By playing Fitch at 8H, even though defensively worse, you have the opportunity, while through conserving the Q and the I, to use those to play Chi for a lucrative 44 points, assuming it's not blocked by your opponent. Now, considering this, the play does actually sim higher when you do leave that hotspot open for yourself. This is another example of the hotspot that you're trying to close or preventing from being opened can actually benefit you a lot more than your opponent. It's similar to closing down the board in an about even game when you're holding the last blank and are more likely to bingo. Let's look at one more example to try and put defense into context. I'll start with an example and introduce more and more info about the game, and you'll see how little pieces of information can drastically change the approach that you're going to take with your play. Let's look at the board. It's pretty closed down. There are 3 hotspots and great bingo lanes through the E-A-M. If you're going to play completely defensively, the best bet would be to block the bingo lanes, your opponent's best opportunity on scoring big. Second, let's look at your rack. It's fairly balanced, but upon inspection you will realize no bingos will play through a beam. And furthermore, there's no 6-letter word to grab the triple word score at 15-0. There are a bunch of plays that score over 30 though. Most of them in row 12, such as fiod and fade, but also one in row 5, food. Taking offense and leave into account, all of the moves are about equal. However, with one blank unseen, the added defense of playing in row 12 will probably work to your favor. In addition, conserving the O would allow you to access the hotspot in row 5 during your next turn. Third, let's look at your opponent's last turn, Veiny. We can make inferences from this as well. The V and Y are terrible letters, and your opponent is obviously playing them off. Had it been for a low score, you would infer that he is left with good tiles, else he would have exchanged. He scored well, so his motivation remains unclear, and his leave could reasonably be anything. However, if he did have a bingo-friendly rack, he may have conserved the EN and just played Ivy. While this gives 10 points less, it gives a better leave and keeps more bingo lanes open. He could have also exchanged and left the board completely open and unblockable. From these, I would suspect your opponent is not looking to bingo next turn and would possibly go for the better leave by playing food. Finally, let's look at the score. It's looking pretty grim. You're trailing by 78 points. I haven't talked about this too much, and I will more in a later video, but when you trail, you want to open up the board to allow you to make a comeback. This also explains why your opponent played Veiny in the last move, essentially closing all the bingo lanes that you had to play through Agnail. It is very likely that your opponent will be blocking the bingo lanes through a beam pretty soon to prevent you from bingoing. So let's go back up to row 5. Playing food keeps great bingo tiles, but with nowhere to play them. But wait, let's look at a completely different option. Foot scores 4 points less and has a worse leave. However, it is special. In this case, foot takes a prefix A for a foot, which just happens to leave in your rack, and also happens to be the only A left unplayed. We create an extra bingo lane in column A, ensuring that no matter where your opponent plays, he will leave you with at least one bingo lane. A guaranteed opportunity to get back into the game. Here, foot is your play. In simulations, we see fiod, food, and fade all win about 11% of the time, but foot wins 15% of the time. The numbers are low, it's a small margin, but that extra 4% is going to be vital for you to winning this game. Defense changes a lot when you come to the end of the game. Now, if you tile track, you can develop a good idea or sometimes an exact idea of the tiles your opponent has on their rack depending on what phase the game is in. At this point, defense changes from a game of uncertainty to a game of certainty. And at this point, most players will identify their opponent's opportunities about as thoroughly as they identify their own opportunities. I'll talk more about the end game and tile tracking in subsequent videos. There are often times when your two best plays consist of a very offensive and a very defensive option, yet are fairly comparable. Now, as I've said before, when you're in this situation, as a beginner, always go for the points. Because as they say, and this applies to Scrabble as well, often the best defense is a good offense. Beyond this, knowing which to play often relies on personal preference. But it can also rely on the context of the game, such as how many tiles are left in the bag, or what the score is. Now when we get into this starts to touch on the topic of advanced board management, and I'll be covering that in a later video. For now, happy Scrabbling and good luck on all your games.